Hello, welcome back to Vote and Voice. If you look around the world today, it feels completely natural that the entire planet is divided into neatly broad pieces of land called countries. It's a fancy word. We carry passports that declare our allegiance to one specific flag. We sing anthems at sporting events, and we look at maps with clear, distinct lines separating us from them. And we take it for granted that humanity is naturally sorted into nations, and that each nation has an inherent right to govern itself in a way. But if you were to step into a time machine and travel back just a few centuries, this entire way of organizing the world would look utterly more alien-based. For most of human history, people did not think of themselves primarily as citizens of a clansman in a tribe, but the idea that a shared cultural identity should match up perfectly with the political board as actually a surprising modern invention. So that radical invention is what we call nationalism. So it is arguably the most powerful political force of the modern era. It has built empires and torn them apart, has sparked some of the most bloodiest wars in human history, and fueled some of the most inspiring movements for freedom and self-determination. Yet, despite how much it shapes our daily lives, it is a concept that is deeply misunderstood and remarkably difficult to pin down. What exactly is a nation? So, is it something real, rooted in ancient blood and soil, or is it an invention of modern elites trying to hold societies together? Why does an idea that can inspire such a profound solidarity and sacrifice also possess the capacity to unleash devastating exclusion and violence? Today, we are going to go on comprehensive journey through the story of nationalism. We will unpack its complex vocabulary, trace its historical roots from the ashes of revolutions to the digital spaces of the 21st century, examine its very many different forms, and look at the profound debates that continue to surround it. So in everyday speech, we tend to use the words nation, state, and country as if they mean the exact same thing. And we say the United Nations when we really mean an association of independent governments. And it's not a world government, but it is some sort of international organization. When we talk about international relations, we mean relations between states. But in political science, these terms have distinct, precise meanings, and separating them is the key to unlocking how nationalism works. Okay, so let's start with the word state. In political theory, a state is not a cultural entity, but rather it is a legal and political structure. It is a defined theory with a permanent population, a centralized government, and sovereignty, which is the supreme independent authority to govern itself and make its own laws without outside interference. And a state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within its borders. It runs the courts, the police, and the military. If you have a government, a clear border, and the international recognition, you have a state, regardless of whether the people inside that border have anything in common culturally. So a nation, on the other hand, is entirely social and cultural. A nation is a large group of people who believe they share a common identity, a collective history, a distinct culture, and a shared destiny. They usually share a language, a tradition, a specific homeland, and crucially, a nation does not need to have its own government to exist. The Kurds are an example of a stateless nation. So they are an ethnic group that have millions of people with a shared language and culture that's spread across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, but they do not have an independent state of their own. So that's how you define a stateless nation. And, another example is the Catalan people, like in the southeastern part of Spain, like that specific area. Like there's been independence movements around there because they see themselves as different compared to, Spain. And when you fuse these two concepts together, you get the holy grail of modern politics, the nation state. So this is a political unit where the boundaries of the cultural group, the nation, align perfectly with the boundaries of the political system, the state. It is an arrangement where government rules over a population that feels it belongs to a single shared cultural community. So nationalism at its core is simply the political ideology which asserts the nation and state should be congruent. It is the belief that every distinct cultural nation deserves its own sovereign political home, and the ultimate source of political legitimacy comes from the nation itself. And this is rather than some sort of monarch or god or ruling class. Where does this word nation even come from? Its history reveals just how much its meaning has shifted over time. The term roots back to the Latin word natio, which literally is translated to a bird, a breed, or a race of animals. In ancient Rome, it was used somewhat dismissively to describe a distant tribe or a group of foreigners who shared a common origin but lacked political organization. When medieval universities in Europe, like the University of Paris, began drawing students from all over the continent, the students organized themselves into student unions called nationes, based on where they traveled from or what language they spoke. If you spoke a certain dialect or Romance language, you joined the French nation. If you spoke a Germanic tongue, you joined the German nation. It was a way of categorizing people by geographic region, but it carried absolutely no connotation of statehood, government, or political rights. It was not until the late 18th century, around the time of American and French revolutions, Age of Enlightenment, that the word underwent a massive transformation. It stopped being a passive description of where you were born and became a militant political concept. To declare yourself a member of a nation was no longer an acknowledgement of your native tongue, and it was a claim to political ownership over the territory you lived in. The nation became identified with the people, and the people became identified with the supreme authority of the land. This brings us to fundamental question that scholars have spent centuries arguing over. What actually makes a nation? What is the secret ingredient that binds millions of strangers together so tightly that they are willing to pay taxes for one another, obey the same laws, and in extreme circumstances lay down their lives for one another? If you ask a nationalist, they might tell you it is something ancient and obvious, like a shared ancestry, a common language, or a sacred piece of land. Well, when you look closer, you realize that nations are built out of a complex, shifting cocktail of elements, and different nationalist movements emphasize completely different ingredients. Language is often considered the most obvious marker of a nation. It is the vehicle through which we express our thoughts and tell our stories. When a group of people speaks the same language, they can communicate effortlessly, creating an immediate sense of familiarity and trust. Think of how powerful language was in shaping the identities of Germany or Italy before they became unified countries. Intellectuals argued that the boundaries of the language were the natural boundaries of the fatherland, but language alone cannot be the sole definer of a nation. Consider Switzerland, a highly stable, deeply patriotic nation state that operates smoothly with 4 distinct national languages: German, French, Italian, and Romance. On the flip side, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom all share the same English language, yet they are distinct independent nations and have their own dialect. So if language is an absolute requirement, what about ethnicity, ancestry, or race? Some nationalist movements define a nation as an extended family or a community bound by shared bloodlines, common ancestors, and a genetic lineage stretching back into antiquity. This is what we call an ethnic definition of the nation. In this view, you cannot simply choose to join a nation, you are born into it. For centuries, this biological view of the nation was deeply entrenched across much of Central and Eastern Europe. But as historians are quick to point out, the idea of genetically pure nation is entirely a myth. Every modern nation is a genetic tapestry woven from countless different groups who cross paths over millennia. The belief in a shared bloodline is often far more important than the actual biological reality. Religion is another incredibly potent force that can serve as the bedrock of national identity. For many centuries and communities, faith is what drew the line between us and them. It's in group, out group. Think of how Irish nationalism became deeply intertwined with Roman Catholicism as a way to distinguish and defend itself against centuries of British Protestant rule. Look at how Pakistan was founded explicitly as a homeland for Muslims of the Indian subcontinent, separating itself from a Hindu-majority India. Religion provides an instant set of shared values, sacred texts, and communal rituals. Yet, just like language, it can be a divisive foundation. Many modern nations are profoundly pluralistic, containing citizens of multiple faiths or no faith at all, held together by civic principles rather than a shared creed. Then there's the physical element, territory and borders. A nation almost always requires a sense of place, a specific geography that the group considers its sacred homeland. This is not just any piece of land, but it is a landscape invested with deep emotional meaning. It is the soil where the ancestors are buried, the mountains celebrated in traditional poetry, the rivers that fed the first settlements. Borders are the lines that carve this sacred space out of the rest world. They turn abstract space into a bounded place of belonging. Within these borders, the concept of citizenship transforms national identity into a legal reality, granting individuals specific rights and responsibilities, and drawing a hard line between who is a member of the community and who is an outsider. One important thing to note out is that a nation cannot exist purely in space. It must also exist in time. It requires a shared history, a collective memory of triumphs and tragedies. Nations are built on stories of great victories, heroic sacrifices, and even deep historical traumas. When a group of people remembers the same golden age or mourns the same historical injustices, they are bound together by a shared emotional inheritance. Interestingly, one of the most famous thinkers in this topic, a 19th century French scholar named Ernest Renan, made the brilliant observation that shared history requires not just remembering, but a healthy dose of forgetting. He argued that for a nation to exist, its people must have forgotten the brutal violence, the internal massacres, and the bitter divisions that occurred during the early formation. If every subgroup within a country constantly nurtured every historical grudge from 500 years ago, the social fabric would collapse. A nation must collectively agree on what to remember and what to let it go. To keep these memories alive, nations rely heavily on myths, traditions, and symbols. These are the visual and auditory anchors of national identity. Consider the flag. It is ultimately just a piece of colored cloth, yet people will weep when it is raised, like for sports, displayed on their homes for national pride, and treat it with a reverence usually preserved for sacred religious icons. Think of the national anthem, a simple melody and lyric that can cause an entire stadium of thousands of strangers to stand up in unison, place their hands over their hearts, and experience the powerful shared emotional swell. These symbols are supplemented what historians call invented traditions, and many of the rituals, holidays, and traditional clothing items that we think of as ancient and timeless were actually consciously created in the 19th or 20th centuries to foster a sense of national unity. Whether it is the creation of national Thanksgiving holiday, the revival of traditional folk dances, the construction of grand monuments to national heroes, these symbols transform an abstract political concept into something tangible, emotional, and everyday. Ultimately, all of these ingredients, language, territory, history, symbols, and institutions, they serve to create what the political scientist Benedict Anderson beautifully termed an imagined community. And he argued that the nation is an imagined community because the members of even the smallest nation will never know, meet, or even hear most of their fellow members. If you live in a nation of 300 million people, you will only ever encounter a tiny fraction of them during your lifetime. Yet in the minds of each individual lives the image of their communion. When you watch the national news, vote in an election, or cheer for your country's team during the Olympics, you feel an instinctive connection to millions of total strangers. You imagine them doing the same thing, sharing the same values, and belonging to the same family in a way. It is a profound psychological sense of identity and belonging that generates social cohesion. It is the invincible glue that allows large-scale modern societies to function. It provides a baseline of solidarity that makes social welfare systems possible. People are far more willing to pay taxes to support public schools, hospitals, and safety nets to build a better society in a way when they feel that it's part of their extended national family. However, because these ingredients can be mixed in so many different ways, different nationalist movements around the world have defined the nation in radically conflicting terms. Some emphasize a civic model where the nation is defined by adherence to political principles, laws, and citizenship, open to anyone regardless of where they were born, and others cling to an ethnic or cultural model, where membership is exclusive, tied to a specific race, ancestry, language, religious faith. This tension between inclusion and exclusion just shows that, universal political rights and particular cultural identities is a thread that runs through the entire history and nationalism. Now that we have dismantled the vocabulary and examined the building blocks of what makes a nation, it is time to turn our attention to the history. So, how did we get here? If nationalism is an eternal natural feature of human life, how and why would it emerge? To answer that, we have to look at the world before nations, understand the massive intellectual earthquakes of the Enlightenment, and witness the explosive revolutions that fundamentally rewrote the rules of human civilization. Before we appreciate how nationalism reshaped the world, we need to understand the types of identities that existed before it. For most of human history, people's sense of belonging was simultaneously much smaller and much larger than the modern nation state. On the local level, your world was defined by what historians call localism or parochialism. Your identity was rooted in your village, your valley, town, or your immediate clan. If you were a peasant farming the fields of central France in the 16th century, you did not identify as French. You likely spoke a local dialect that someone in Paris wouldn't even understand. Your loyalty was to your family, your neighbors, and the local lord who extracted taxes from you and offered protection in return. Travel was limited. Information moved at speed of a walking horse, and the abstract idea of a vast kingdom filled with millions of other Frenchmen was completely beyond your daily horizon. At the exact same time, people possessed massive transcontinental identities that skipped right over the national level. The most important of these was religion. If you were that son of a medieval peasant, or a scholar or nobleman, you belonged to the Western Christendom. You shared a universal faith that looked to the Pope in Rome as a spiritual authority. And if you were educated, you wrote and conversed in Latin, the universal language of European elite. A Catholic knight in Spain often felt a deeper sense of shared identity and common purpose with a Catholic knight in Germany, and then he did with a non-Christian peasant just living just across the border. In the Islamic world, the concept of Ummah, the global community of Muslim believers, transcended geography, language, and ethnicity under the umbrella of various caliphates. So for political authority in this pre-modern world was built on local dynastic loyalty, not national identity. Empires and kingdoms were the personal property of ruling families. Land and populations were bought, sold, inherited, and traded through royal marriages and treaties with zero regard for the language or culture of people living on that land. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which survived well into the 20th century, was a classic example of this. The Habsburg dynasty ruled over a spectacular mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Italians, Slovenians, Croats, and Serbs. They were not held together by a shared culture. They were held together simply because they all owed allegiance to the same emperor. Political legitimacy came from above, from divine right, royal bloodlines, and imperial conquest, never from below, from the consent of a unified cultural group. The old world of dynastic empires and universal religious identities began to fracture under the weight of a massive intellectual movement in the 18th century, which is called the Enlightenment. Thinkers across Europe began to challenge the traditional foundations of society, questioning the divine right of kings, the absolute authority of the church, and the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system. They championed reason, science, individual liberty, and most importantly for our story, the concept of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the radical idea that the ultimate authority of a government does not come from God or a royal bloodline, but from the consent of the people being governed. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argue that a legitimate political order is built on a social contract among individuals. But this intellectual shift created a massive immediate problem. If the king is no longer the anchor of the state, who exactly are the people? If the glue of dynastic loyalty is dissolved, what holds the state together and stops it from fracturing into chaos? The answer emerged to fill this vacuum was the nation. The abstract concept of the people needed a concrete emotional identity that the nation provided. The state was no longer the personal estate of the monarch. It was the collective property of the national community. We see the first explosive world-changing applications of these ideas in the late 18th century, starting with the American Revolution. When the 13 American colonies declared their independence from the British Crown in 1776, they were making a profoundly ideological claim. They were asserting that they, as a distinct community, had the right to self-determination. They were not defining themselves by a shared ancient ethnicity. After all, they shared ancestry and language with the very British Empire they were fighting against. Instead, they were forging a new kind of nation based on shared political principles, a commitment to liberty, and a collective struggle against tyranny. The American experiment demonstrated to the world that a nation could be consciously constructed around a set of ideas and a constructural framework. But if the American Revolution was a warning shot across the bow of the old world, the French Revolution of 1789 was the full-scale detonation. The French Revolution took the abstract theories of the Enlightenment and turned them into a political hurricane that tore through Europe. When the revolutionaries overthrew King Louis XVI, they didn't just change the government, but they redefined the state in more socialist ideas instead of like this caste system that felt more autocratic or oligarchic. The famous Declaration of Rights of Man and of the citizen state explicitly, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from it. In one fell swoop, the subjects of the French king were transformed into citizens of the French nation. This was an incredibly empowering shift, but it also required an unprecedented level of social mobilization. To defend the revolution against the monarchies of Europe, the new French government instituted the Levée en masse, and that's translated into a universal conscription that drafted every able-bodied young man into the military. This was a defining moment in the history of nationalism. In the past, wars were fought by small professional armies of merchandises and noblemen. Now wars were fought by the nation in arms. Millions of ordinary citizens were told that the state was theirs, and because it belonged to them, they had secure duty to fight and die for it, saying like, oh, you can take your life, but can't take my freedom. To turn these diverse peasants from different regions into unified Frenchmen, the revolutionary government launched a massive campaign for cultural standardization. They pushed for a single national language, suppressed regional dialects, created a national education system, and designed calendar flags and patriotic festivals to cultivate an immense emotional devotion to the Republic. So, across Europe, this romantic emotional view of nation spread like wildfire. Intellectuals, poets, and historians began diving into ancient archives, collecting traditional folk tales, compelling dictionaries for local languages, and writing epic historical narratives to prove that their nations had ancient glorious roots. So why do historians disagree so intensely about nationalism? Because nationalism is a chameleon. If you look at Western Europe, the modernist argument looks very convincing. States like France and Britain used the machinery of government to mold diverse populations into unified nations. But if you look at Eastern Europe, the ethno-symbolist view feels much more accurate. Distinct ethnic communities kept their languages and identities alive for centuries under foreign empires until they finally exploded into independent states. What we say for certain is that the arrival of the 19th century, the debate was no longer just academic, but the idea had spread the pages of philosophy books and entered the streets, setting the stage for a century of revolution, unification, and fragmented empires. So that's it for part 1. I'll see you in part 2, and thank you for watching.